This one's primarily, as you can see, on world building, the why and how. We're going to cover a couple of things: main components of a world and societies within, types and aspects of societies, integrating the world building into your story organically a little bit. I'm thinking I might actually do another tutorial on how to do that better, because one of my favorite writers is English writer by the name of Lee Child. He writes the Jack Reacher books. And I love the books, but the problem is he will sometimes have anywhere from like 2 to 10 pages. In one of the books he had, he was describing how a rundown factory would have worked if it still worked. It took like 10 pages, and I just wanted to bash my head into a brick wall because it had nothing to do with the plot. Um, he does that often. So there's an easier way to do it. I mean, you could do it that way if you want, but it's pretty mind-numbingly boring. And the benefits of world building. So that's basically what we're going to go through today. Now, what makes a world? You don't necessarily have to have all these things. You will have to have some of them. Religion, you don't really have to have, but even so, you still have to address it some way. You still have to deal with it. You have geography, economy, political structure, military, and culture. Now, just as an aside, we're going to go through each one of them individually, and I think I stated in the overview as well, but all of these kind of interact with each other in one uh, way, shape, or form, but we'll get to that at the end. So first up, geography. Geography affects multiple aspects of the world. Um, for instance, food. Places like Japan and the Scotland, England, Wales, Ireland tend to have a lot of seafood because they're island nations. So um, different biomes and things like that will have different foods, uh, have different resources, different cultures based around them. Because we always tend to view, like for instance, we view the Nordic nations and Russians as like really tough, hardy people. We tend to view people who live in harsh environments like that as extraordinarily tough. I mean, deserts are really, really brutal places. I'd actually rather be in a tundra, in a frozen tundra, than a desert. But we tend not to view people who are desert people as particularly robust, at least not as much as we do people who live in tundras. So again, that might be something that affects them because a harsh place will breed harsh people, and vice versa. It also affects, what based on geography, what resources it has, how they move, how they fight, things of that nature. So when is it landlocked? Is it coastal? Is it an island nation? Kind of goes along with coastal, but you could have something like, France or Germany, which aren't islands, but they have coastlines, things like that, so on and so forth. These are pretty self-explanatory, but it's easy to forget about them because one, they're kind of boring. Going through, you want to think about, the grandeur of these different civilizations and how their cities look and the magic or technology that they have and, the history behind it. But you kind of have to deal with these first. It's kind of like playing Minecraft where you just start off and you're like, you've played Minecraft a dozen times before. You're like, oh, I gotta fucking punch trees and dig dirt before I can get to the fun stuff. It doesn't cover multiple biomes. You take a place like the United States, for instance, it has, uh, boreal rainforest, like you have the Pacific Northwest, you have like Maine, things like that. You have um, deserts, you have swamps, you have it's kind of subtropical around Florida, you have plains and things like that. Or is it just like one essential, like one biome? England, there's no deserts in England. There's no frozen tundra or whatever, so on and so forth. What resources exist in there? And this will, again, is it primarily agrarian? Do they farm? Like, is it crops, cattle, things like that? Are they more industrial? Is mining a huge part of their economy? Do they export? Like, what kind of metals? With the variety of metals? Is that how they got rich? Did they, you know, are they have huge deposits of like steel or say like vibranium, for instance. Wakanda from the Marvel Universe is a good example. They're pretty much the only source of vibranium on the planet, and it pretty much shapes their entire or it shapes a large part of their culture, their technology and things like that, and sort of their isolationist period, or not period, but policy rather. On how does the geography affect trade? For instance, if they are an island nation, they're probably going to have a strong maritime or naval tradition. If they're wide open like steppe people like the Mongols or certain tribes of Native Americans, horse is going to be a huge part of their economy, things like that. So geography all plays into that. It plays into how they fight, how it plays into what crops they have. It plays into pretty much everything. We are essentially nothing without the land that we live on. And this is very general. Again, I don't know the form the rest of it, the other aspects of the world, but it all kind of starts from the geography. No pun intended. It starts from the ground up. So you have to decide where in the world they're at, what exactly is the geometry, mountainous, plains, desert, tundra, forest, jungle. Everything else essentially flows from that. And some good examples of this, again, in by the way, there are going to be some spoilers here. They're not going to be too deep spoilers. They're going to be like essentially kind of surface level spoilers. There's going to be stuff you can. By that I mean stuff you could see in, uh, in trailers or just general knowledge. Like if I say there's a power called the Force in the Star Wars universe, you can't really say that's a spoiler. Um, it's just some. It's a real basic aspect of, or real basic part of that universe. It's not really a spoiler. But regardless, if I feel like it's a spoiler, I'll try to say something ahead of time. All right, religion. Is it monotheistic, polytheistic? For those of you who don't know, you probably all know, but just in case, monotheistic means you worship one god. Polytheistic means multiple gods. So, good examples of monotheism, at least in the real world. Uh, Judaism, kind of Judeo-Christian faiths. Islam, polytheism. You have Greek mythology, Norse mythology, Japanese, Chinese mythology, Egyptian mythology, things like that. Philosophical. I tend to view Buddhism as and the polytheistic. You might want to add Shinto would be a good example of that. Although they worship spirits, they don't necessarily worship a deity. But in Shintoism, pretty much everything has a spirit to it. Philosophical, and what I mean by that, Buddhism I kind of think is more of a philosophical religion, not necessarily religion in the same way that everything else is. A good example of a fictional philosophical religion is the Force from Star Wars. They don't worship a deity; they kind of worship, or not necessarily worship, they follow a philosophy, and it's somewhat like a religion. It's kind of religion adjacent. So if you don't really want religion in your world, or rather, if you don't want a lot of religion in your world, you might choose a more philosophical religion. Are there dead religions? You don't need to have this in here, but for instance, you don't hear much about Zoroastrianism in the real world anymore. You just don't. You kind of consider, aside from popular culture, you know, nobody in Nordic nations really worships Odin or Thor or Tyr. Nobody in Egypt really worships Ra or Set or Isis or anything like that. So these kind of be examples of dead religions. You can also have like a confluence of religions, kind of like Sikhism is kind of a mixture between Hinduism and Islam. Another good example in Japan. I was watching a documentary on Japan, and one of the things they were talking about religion is that they get married using Christian or Catholic, or using Christian. Um, and when they're born, they're celebrated using Shinto um, what's the word? Shinto rituals. They're married with Christian rituals, and they're buried and watched over by with Buddhist rituals. So it's really a confluence of multiple religions, some along those lines. I'm probably misremembering some of the specifics, but in general, there are multiple religions kind of present, or religious rituals present within Japan. So your civilization might have something along those lines. What groups worship what? Now we'll discuss ethnic groups later on, but obviously, again, certain civilizations, the Norse the Norse don't worship Zeus and Hera and Athena and things like that. So certain groups will have certain religious beliefs. They could be the source of those beliefs. They could have those. They could have adopted those beliefs. They could have those beliefs forced upon somebody via a conquering nation or or another conquering civilization. Things like that. So, and also, this is probably more important. I mean, it's still fairly important, but not necessary. Um, Specifically, because there are stories that and rich and kind of universes that don't deal with religion at all, and if they do, it's kind of secondhand. It's like some sentence, some throwaway sentence over here. But again, obviously, if your civilization is heavily religious, this is going to be very important. Um, I wanted to add what what is the when you think about religion, you think about how the people who worship the religion, how devout are they, and how they view not only their religion but other religions. Um, this will go more into how to integrate it, and again, that'll be um, a separate work stream altogether. But one thing you could say is, the group and I were traveling through the square. Off the left, we saw five bodies still hung up on the gallows. The punishment for worshiping Razaken or something like that. That's a way you can integrate it into your writing. So you know that there's a god named Razaken. Whatever civilization that they're in right now, they don't like that god, and worship is punishable by death. They're more devout to their religion, whatever their religion may be, things like that. So you want to also deal with how the religions interact with each other within the civilization, if they do at all. Another good example is for anybody who watches Critical Role, um, which is a D&D stream with voice actors who don't know. One of the cities that they go to, called Vasselheim, only allows, um, for instance, magic from divine sources. They're a very religious city. They don't allow arcane resources or arcane magic. Another city that was in the previous campaign, the season 1 campaign. The season 2 campaign, the empire that they all start in, they only allow the worship of 5 gods or a handful of gods and no other gods, regardless of whether or not they're evil or good. You can only worship 5 gods. They're the only ones approved by the empire. So that's another thing you might want to add into. We haven't really gotten to this because we haven't done the D&D campaign that I run, but with D&D campaign I run with my friends, there's a city they haven't gone to yet that doesn't allow religion at all. It's forbidden. It's strictly forbidden. Those are things you might want to add. And if you have one society that's highly religious and they have to deal with a society that is deeply atheistic, how those groups uh, interact with each other is going to be somewhat important. You want to address it at a certain point. Another example, and my friend's going to groan for me bringing this up, in Warhammer 40k, uh, at least in the Imperium Man, the human empire, there is one religion called the Imperial Creed, which worships the Emperor, but you have other factions that, for instance, the Adeptus Mechanicus, which handles all of the technology, has their own religion, which technically should be forbidden under the rules of the Imperium, but they're allowed to because they're too useful. That's again something you might want to keep into account. Are there exceptions to the the rules surrounding your religion, and if so, why? Another example within Warhammer 40k in the Imperium, The kind of the elite special forces of the Imperium are the Adeptus Astartes. They almost all of them, there are some exceptions, almost all of them follow what's called the Imperial Truth, which is a atheistic view. There are no gods, and religion is strictly outlawed. But again, they're allowed within the Imperium because they're too useful to get rid of. They also clash with other factions within the Imperium of Man that are very religious. So those are things you want to keep into um, things you want to keep in mind. All right, economy. All right, everything runs on money. This is definitely something you'll almost certainly have to deal with, especially if your characters buy something. What is the economy based on? And by that means, what is the basis of the economy? Is your civilization one that's very art oriented and they export art and, you know, for instance, in America we have Hollywood. It's a big, big money maker. You have also Bollywood from India and things like that. Is that a huge part of the economy? Is it primarily an entertainment economy? Do people come? Do people come to your civilization um, because it's beautiful and you get a lot of money from tourism, things like that? Are you, again, agrarian? Do you export a lot of food, cattle, things like that? Also, beasts of burden or horses. And it also depends on if it's futuristic, modern, fantasy, sci-fi, whatever the case may be. Obviously, if you're in a futuristic society, unless maybe it's the Firefly universe, you're probably not going to be exporting a lot of horses. Just probably something you're not interested in. So it could be, again, technology based. Is your civilization or one civilization on the cutting edge of technology? Is another civilization based on military? Is it a civilization that primarily makes its money by sending its people out as mercenaries, as for other hired mercenaries for other civilizations in their wars, things like that. What does it produce? Again, what what is it? Again, is it like again Wakanda? Does it have a lot of vibranium? That's another example. One example would be um, in Game of Thrones. I'm using kind of really uh, popular, more widely known universes here. They're not necessarily ones you have to model them after. I'm just trying to use it to kind of cast a wide net. In um, Game of Thrones, the Lannisters had the gold mines. The Tyrells produced most of the food, things like that. What does it trade? Again, this is usually based on what it's produced, but also if it lacks something, if you have a civilization that is very land rich but resource poor, it might trade tracts of land or it might export whatever minuscule resources that it has to gain everything that it needs. So it may be a mining heavy civilization that has a lot of, copper, tin, coal, salt, steel, but it lacks enough arable land and uh, farming land, rather, or fertile land, I should say, to produce enough food for its own people. So it might trade all of the metals and things like that, and all the things in mines to get a lot of food, and vice versa. It could also be just a trading hub. It might not have that strong of a uh, resource or agrarian or industrial civilization. For instance, it could be an island nation in the middle of two other islands, like this small island nation flanked by continents, and a lot of traders from both continents stop off in this island nation, and that's how they make most of their money through tariffs and tax and things like that, because people come there to resupply and trade. So that's another way it could make money. Again, you don't have to stick to these examples specifically. These aren't the only examples. And again, depending on whether or not if your civilization is a fantasy or sci-fi civilization, you make up whatever the hell you want. So it doesn't really matter, but those are just some examples that might help you. How is taxation handled? A good example from um, the real world, for lack of a better term, is in Japan. Samurai originally were, in addition to being warriors, they were tax collectors. and they would often tax farmers. And it was easy to tax farmers because most farmers are rice farmers. And the thing about farming rice is that it's a labor-intensive crop that really takes you a couple years to see any sort of profit from it. It's something that requires near constant maintenance. Uh, you can't just really pick like oh man, my local lord is being too harsh. I'll just pick up and leave. You really couldn't do that. You were pretty much married to the land of which you farmed, so it made taxation very easy. Some things that kind of keep in mind: is taxation easy? Is it hard? How is it handled? Do certain groups pay more? Certain groups pay less? Things like that. Is it simply money, or are they paid in resources, for instance? Instead of actually paying through gold, maybe a civilization pays a tithe of whatever resources that they have, and those resources then used to trade to other civilizations, and that's how the nation gains its money. So again, depends on your world. It's something you have to think about, uh, very specific to whatever you come up with. But again, an economy, you know, the old saying, money makes the world go round, and that's pretty much true even in fictional worlds. Political structure. Again, this is also very important, particularly uh, if your story in the universe deals a lot with political intrigue, and that's kind of the main plot. Excuse me. Uh, Religion will also play into this as well, if religion is a big part. It's very popular. I was playing Final Fantasy Tactics over again, and a large part of that plot is revolves around. Again, this isn't much of a spoiler. Wait till my brain stops mumbling and actually gets to a coherent sentence structure. A lot of it revolves around kind of the state religion and political intrigue and how those two things interact with each other. Um, so this is another good example. And again, Game of Thrones almost all about political intrigue. Star Wars doesn't focus. I'm not too up on the extended universe, but for the most part, like a Star Wars, the movies at least don't deal a lot with political intrigue. It's mostly about Jedi versus Sith, so on and so forth. But you still need somewhat of a political structure. Okay, so you have one ruler or many rulers. Is it a king, a queen, emperor, empress, whatever, a single ruler at the top, and everybody does what they have to say? Or is it many? Is it formed on the basis of a council? Is there like, is it a council of maybe five, six, seven, eight people? Or is it a large council, kind of like the Senate in Rome, or the modern Congress that we have in the United States, or House of Lords, House of Commons you have in Great Britain, things like that. Are they the sole rulers, or is there one ruler and the council? Again, similar to how we have in the United States, we have a president, we have Congress, and we have we got the Congress rather. I was going to say Senate and House of Representatives, but we have the president and we have Congress, things like that. Is it a centralized rule, or does it revolve a lot around other rule, kind of less prestigious but still higher ranked rulers? For instance, you have kings in Europe, especially like the medieval period. You have kings and you had barons and dukes and lords and things like that, and they kind of ruled their own section, and the king kind of ruled the other. Um, Kind of very simplified explanation for this, but the king would rule the lesser lords around them, if that's how you do it. Who decides the rulers? I got another good example from Japan. For a long time in Japan's history, it was the shogun that ran. Um, is it shogun or daimyo? I can't remember. It was a shogun. The shogun that ran Japan, but only the emperor could decide the shogun. Outside of deciding the shogun, the emperor had no real power. So that's something you want to think of. That obviously wasn't true for all of Japan's history, but for a portion of it, it was. So is that maybe how they're decided? Are they decided by a council? Um, in modern Britain, the people don't actually vote for the prime minister. what they do is they vote for their MPs or members of parliament, and they belong to a particular party. And whatever party has a majority, that party decides from within that party who is the ruler. So, for instance, if the Tory, which is a party, the Tory party in Britain, if they choose, let's go Labour Party is probably another example. I'm not sure if they use Tories anymore. I think they do, but say the Labour Party wins in Great Britain. Okay, so they have the majority. Now the Labour Party, not the actual citizens of Britain, the members of Parliament within the Labour Party, they decide from within the Labour Party who the Prime Minister is. Versus in America, where we have the actual people decide who the president is. Or is it decided by the church? You know. So do the lords and the kings and queens or whatever not really have any issue, and the church, someone of a religious uh, someone high rank within the church or whatever religion, whatever it is. I don't want to say church specifically, but the highest ranking member within that religion, do they decide the ruler? And is it kind of a thing where they choose who the best candidate for the job is amongst the lords, or is it somewhere where there's a lot of intrigue and bribing and things like that? What is the structure of the rulers? Again, do you have one ruler at the top and they decide everything, and they just have underlings that only have whatever authority that the person at the top decides, or does the person at the top rely on the other lords and they have their own autonomy to a certain extent, and the one ruler at the top, we'll say king for the sake of argument, does the king have to kind of negotiate with the lords? Can they say, I have a call to arms, and some of the lords say, yeah, no, I don't really refuse, and the king has to go like, I can't really do anything about it? Or do they have kind of absolute power, and somebody says, I refuse, and you just strip them all their titles and you can murder them, and there aren't going to be any real consequences? Or is it like a system of checks and balances? You know, does the like a constitutional monarchy is another good example. Britain for a long time had a constitutional monarchy. So the king or queen had a lot of power, but it was limited by certain restrictions placed on them by the people. Again, you can make up whatever religion you want, or you can kind of Google or search online rather for some examples uh, of modern or ancient, or I should say real world governments, to come up with a sort of political structure that might work for your universe. How much power does general populace have? Kind of went through that as well. What restrictions, if any, are placed on the rulers? Again, is it a constitutional monarchy? Is it a total monarchy? Is your ruler a dictator? Is it a good example would be a military dictatorship? Is your civilization used to be a monarchy, used to be a constitutional monarchy, used to be a democracy or whatever, a constitutional republic, and the military took over, and now that's all gone to shit? Is your nation or your civilization or world in upheaval because the political structure that ruled it for so long has been destroyed or has been usurped? And if those restrictions exist, if any, how are those restrictions decided? Are they decided by the people? Are they put on them by the lords? Again, if you have a monarch that has to negotiate with the lords, is every time a king gets put on the throne, do things change because they have to now argue with whatever lords and ladies now rule their lands? Again, this is usually in a decentralized government. If it's centralized, then you probably won't have this issue. Um, Again, those things will factor heavily into your society. And again, at the end, I'll explain why all these things matter. You may be thinking, ugh, because again, world building, I like world building personally, but even though I like it, there are certain aspects of it that are just kind of a slog to get through. And other people, you may absolutely fucking hate world building. And I can certainly understand why you would think that. It's understandable. It's not, um, I'm not going to judge you for it. I don't think anybody really would judge you for it. And if they were, they're kind of being pricks. But again, it's a lot to think about, but it really will help you in the long run. Military.